Hi, ethicists. Today we're talking about egoism. So important to note that in the Rachel's text, if you're using the 4th edition, that we'll be talking about chapter 5 and chapter 6. In the 4th edition, he breaks those into 2 chapters, one on psychological egoism, one on ethical egoism. If you're in the 7th edition, then 7th or 8th edition, then this is all contained in one chapter on egoism. So the principal figures who we're introduced to are Thomas Hobbes, who we talked about when we talked about social contract theory, and Ayn Rand, a more contemporary literary figure. So the 2 types of egoism that we'll be talking about today are psychological egoism and ethical egoism. So, psychological egoism is the view that each person does, in fact, pursue his or her self-interest exclusively. So there are no other regarding actions. There's no working for other people's interests unless it's ultimately for one's own self-interest. Note the difference between psychological egoism and ethical egoism. Ethical egoism is the view that each person should pursue his or her own self-interest exclusively. So those italicized words are the difference, does and should. While psychological egoism is a claim about human nature, what humans in fact do, just always pursue their own self-interest, ethical egoism makes a moral claim that we should pursue our own self-interest exclusively. So it's important to keep these 2 distinct. One reason why it's important to keep them distinct is because imagine if both were true. If psychological egoism was true, that we in fact always pursue our own self-interest exclusively, and ethical egoism was true, that we always should, in other words, that it was always right to pursue our own self-interest exclusively, well, that would actually imply that there was no immoral action for human beings, because we would always be pursuing our self-interest, and it would always be the right thing to do. So any action that was taken, as horrible as they might be, somebody could always say, well, I was pursuing my own self-interest, and that's always the right thing to do. So if egoism is going to be interesting, then one of these would have to be true and not the other. If they're both true, then that just makes ethical deliberation ridiculous, and there would be no wrong actions. There would be no distinction between right and wrong. All right, so now let's move on and talk. We're going to focus on psychological egoism first, and then we'll move to ethical egoism later. So first, let's justify why we're talking about psychological egoism in the first place. So one thing to note is it's not an ethical theory itself. It's a psychological theory, a theory of human nature. But if it's true, there would be far-reaching ethical implications. So there would be no such thing as impartiality, acting from a sense of duty, or altruism, meaning other regarding actions. So if psychological egoism is true, then, for example, Kantian deontology would fall. There would never be any time where we would be motivated by doing the right thing just because it was the right thing to do. Our actions would always be motivated by selfish desires or inclinations. In which case, there would be no morally good, morally worthy actions, according to Kant. So we have to talk about psychological egoism, because if it's true, then that would have really damning implications for some theories that we've covered. Now, you might have thought when you heard the thesis of psychological egoism that people do only act for their own, motivated by their own self-interest. You might have wondered, but wait, people do amazingly generous, heroic things for other people. So how is it possible that anybody would believe the thesis of psychological egoism? It seems on the face of it like people act altruistically, and there's some impressive examples on page 66 of the 7th edition. It talks about the case of Raoul Wallenberg, who risked his life in World War II to smuggle Jewish people out of Germany to save their lives. And he ended up saving, let's see, how many people? All in all, he saved thousands of human lives. And then he ended up dying. So probably because of his activity there. So isn't his action an example of being motivated by other people's well-being, not just his own well-being? So that would imply the falsity of the thesis of psychological egoism. The text gives other examples. Warren Buffett, who donated $37 billion to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to promote global health and education. Zell Kravinsky, who gave his entire $45 million fortune to charity and then donated one of his kidneys to a complete stranger. Aren't these striking counterexamples to psychological egoism and seemingly purely altruistic actions? Well, one thing that makes psychological egoism resilient, why we continue to talk about it and wonder if it might be true, is because even though these people's actions benefited others and might have had significant costs for themselves, it's not clear that they were motivated by those benefits to others. It could be that the people's motivation was ultimately egoistic, that they were pursuing something of their own good. So even when we're thinking about philanthropists like we just discussed, a psychological egoist can always say, yeah, even though they did those things, ultimately what they were aiming at was their own benefit. So the psychological egoist might look at Raoul Wallenberg and think, oh, he was doing that for fame and recognition after the fact. Or he was doing that because of the good feeling that he got from saving people, or to not feel guilty about not saving people from this horrible fate. So their actions, although they have benefits for other people, are consistent with a selfish motivation. That's not to say that they're necessarily motivated by concern with themselves, by their own self-interest. It's just to say that it could be that they had selfish motivation. It could be that they had other regarding motivation. And the psychological egoist can always bring up the doubt about that altruistic motivation and point to a selfish motivation that's consistent with their actions. So this is a strategy of reinterpreting people's motivations. And this has been a problem, at least since Kant recognized that our motivations aren't completely transparent to us. Sometimes we do something thinking the reason we were doing it was one thing, and then later we analyze our own actions and find out it was actually some other selfish motivation. So a psychological egoist has a powerful tool there to reinterpret people's motivations. All right, so now let's look at two arguments in favor of psychological egoism and consider potential problems with them. So first is the argument that we always do what we most want to do. So the argument it's very simple. It just has one premise. We always do what we most want to do. Therefore, our actions are always self-interested. So we're always acting on some desire, and our strongest desire. Therefore, our actions are always self-interested because we're trying to fulfill that desire. There are a couple of objections to this. And since there's only one premise, the objections will be predictable. One objection will be the premise is just not true. And the other objection is even if the premise is true, it won't lend enough support to the conclusion. So the first objection that the premise is not true goes like this. There are things that we do not because we want to, but because we ought to. So the premise that we always do what we most want to do then would be false. Consider an example like writing thank you cards for something. So you've received some gifts for whatever occasion, and now you feel like the right thing to do is to write people thank you cards, thanking them for their gifts. Nobody wants to write thank you cards, so to say that somebody's doing what they most want to do seems like on the face of it like it might just be false. Somebody's doing it because they feel like they have an obligation to write these thank you cards, so they're doing what they feel like they ought to do, not what they most want to do, which is anything but writing thank you cards. Maybe I'm really ungrateful, I'm realizing, but fill in your own example if you're a grateful, happy to write thank you cards kind of person. So this objection says that premise is not true. But I think the psychological egoist might have a defense against this objection. The psychological egoist could say, look, while it's not clear that you most want to do that in the short term, when you're writing thank you cards, you might be thinking about the long term. So you might be thinking, well, I don't want to seem ungrateful to these people, so I'm going to write these thank you cards even though I hate doing it right now, whatever time right now is. I want to do it ultimately because I want to maintain good relationships with these people and not seem ingrateful for the things that they gave me. So while an objection would be the premise is not true, a psychological egoist could say, look, even doing what you ought to do in almost all cases could be consistent with a selfish and egoistic desire. So the second objection I actually think is more interesting. The second objection says, even if the premise is true, that we always do what we most want to do, that does not necessarily mean that your desires are always and exclusively self-interested. Some of our desires are for other people's happiness. So just because we're always acting on our strongest desire, the fact that it's our desire doesn't mean that it's a self-interested desire. The object of our desire, what might fulfill our desire, might be doing something for somebody else. And the fact that that desire is aimed at somebody else's benefit would determine that our action based on it would not be self-interested, it would be other-interested. So interested in fulfilling or benefiting somebody else. So the distinction between selfish and unselfish motivations, or selfish and unselfish actions, won't be whether or not the action was motivated by a desire or not, because clearly, it seems that maybe all of our actions are motivated by some sort of desire. But it's about the content of that desire that will determine whether or not it's self-interested or other-regarding. And if your desire is to benefit somebody else, then your action, even though you might most want to do that action which benefits somebody else, that won't necessarily mean that your action is self-interested. And this claim says it means it's not self-interested, it's other-interested. All right, so this argument, one objection seems like the psychological egoist has a defense against it. The other objection seems like it's pretty strong, that there's some conceptual confusion in the psychological egoist's definition of self-interested if they're proposing motivated as the definition of self-interested. So let's look at a second argument. The second argument says, all our actions are motivated by the expectation of the good feeling they will produce in us, the people performing the action. Therefore, all our actions are self-interested. So we're always looking for a good feeling, a satisfaction that performing an action will give us. Think again about the case of Raoul Wallenberg. Maybe he was performing that action because it felt good to him to save that many people. So again, one premise to this argument. So again, two objections. So we'll see that one is to the truth of the premise, the other is to the support that the premise would give the conclusion even if it were true. So the first objection says, it's just not true that our actions are motivated by the expectation of the good feeling they will produce in us. Sometimes they're not motivated by that expectation. The text gives a nice example, and that's the example of not Raoul Wallenberg, the example of Wesley Autry. So this is on page 70 in chapter 5 in the 7th edition. So it says, in some cases of altruism, we may have no self-interested motives. For example, in 2007, a 50-year-old construction worker named Wesley Autry was waiting for a subway train in New York City. Autry saw a man near him collapse, his body convulsing. The man got up only to stumble to the edge of the platform and fall onto the train tracks. At that moment, the headlights of a train appeared. I had to make a split-second decision, Autry later said. He then leapt onto the tracks and lay on top of the man, pressing him down into a space a foot deep. The train's brakes screeched, but it could not stop in time. People on the platform screamed. 5 cars passed over the men, smudging Autry's blue knit cap with grease. When onlookers realized that both men were safe, they broke out into applause. I just saw someone who needed help, Autry later said. He had saved the man's life, never giving a thought to his own well-being. So I think the argument goes here, if Wesley Autry had taken the time to think about whether his action would produce a good feeling in himself, he wouldn't have time to perform such a risky helping action, that his motivation had to be see somebody in danger, help that person, like immediate response, otherwise he wouldn't have succeeded in helping him. So this says that that action was not motivated by the expectation of the good feeling it will produce in us. It was motivated by something else, a concern directly for somebody in danger. All right, so the second objection says, even if it's true that all our actions are motivated by the expectation of the good feeling our actions will produce in us, the actors, that might not be the only motivation for performing the action, and it might not be the strongest motivation. So even if we're always sometimes motivated by a feeling of satisfaction, we might be motivated by something in addition to that. And that additional motivation, that additional motive might be a genuine concern for other people's well-being. So the premise might not be true if we take the case of Wesley Autry as a counterexample. And even if it were true, there might be a number of motivations which contribute to us ultimately performing an action. Some of those might be things like the feeling of satisfaction that we might get from doing a good action, but others might be genuinely wanting a good thing for somebody else, in which case psychological egoism would be false. All right. So now, having talked a lot about psychological egoism, considered some cases when people seemingly did very altruistic actions, worried that they might be ultimately egoistic, and then considered some ultimately probably faulty arguments in support of psychological egoism, we're going to conclude that psychological egoism has some powerful objections against it. The arguments that are often proposed in its defense don't seem to hold up. So now we'll move on to ethical egoism and see if that fares any better. So recall that ethical egoism is the claim that each person should be motivated by their self-interest exclusively. One strategy of arguing for ethical egoism will be to try to show that altruism, it's that altruistic action is always wrong. So if altruistic action is always wrong, then the only possibility for morally good actions would be the kind which are exclusively self-interested. So let's look at first an argument that altruism is self-defeating. So this argument is a lengthy argument, and it goes like this. First, we understand our own desires better than we understand the desires of others. Generally, this seems like it's true. We have access to our own desires, and we can sort of discuss them with ourselves, so it seems like it's probable that we understand our own desires better than we understand the desires of others. And then we draw a conclusion for that. Therefore, we can fulfill our own desires more easily than we can fulfill the desires of others. So now that conclusion becomes a premise for the further argument, along with looking out for others as an offensive intrusion into other people's privacy. Making other people the object of one's charity robs them of their dignity and self-respect. Recipients of charity cease to be self-reliant and become passively dependent on others. Therefore, each of us should pursue our own self-interest exclusively. So we have an argument here for we shouldn't act regarding others. We should pursue our own self-interest exclusively for all these reasons. Now, when I read through it really fast, it seems like it might be a persuasive argument. But if we go back and take some care to examine some of these premises, whether or not they're true, and even if they're true, if they'd support the conclusion, we'll see that this argument is full of flaws. So first of all, let's look at the sub-argument. We said that it was generally true that we understand our own desires better than we understand the desires of others. But is it always true? It seems that it's not. In fact, an entire profession seems to be based on this claim being false. So it could be that I'm very confused and I have competing desires, and that makes figuring out what my basic desires are, it makes it very difficult. So I might go seek some help with that. So I might go seek the help of a psychologist, right? So a psychologist studying the way the human mind works might tell me, look, you have all these different competing desires. Here they are. They do an analysis of my behavior and the things I say. And it might turn out that somebody else understands my desires better than I do. Sometimes this is the case with kids too. So kids don't understand, very loose grasp, it seems, of their own desires sometimes and what will ultimately fulfill them. So it doesn't seem crazy to say that a parent might understand their desires better than they understand them themselves, having seen their behavior in the past, right? So now, that premise probably isn't true, but let's say it is true, that we understand our own desires better than we understand the desires of others. Would that lead to the conclusion, would that be enough support for the conclusion that we can fulfill our own desires more easily than we can fulfill the desires of others? It doesn't seem so, and here's why. Imagine I know with crystal clear clarity that I want an island, a private island, and a yacht. And I can feel that. The desire is so clear to me that I can feel it. Imagine I only know vaguely that somebody who's starving to death wants to eat an apple that's in my hand. I can't feel their desire, but I can see based on their behavior they probably want to eat the apple. So I have a clear understanding of my own desire that I want a yacht and a private island. I have a vague understanding of them wanting an apple, and yet it seems very clear that I could fulfill their desire much easier than I could fulfill my desire for the yacht and the private island. So even if premise 1 is true of the sub-argument, it doesn't lead to the conclusion 2. But now let's look, so should we believe 2? Well, the argument that supports it isn't very good, so we probably shouldn't. So let's look at the rest of the premises here. Looking out for others is an offensive intrusion into other people's privacy. What I would want to say about that is that sometimes looking out for others is an offensive intrusion into their privacy. But oftentimes it seems like it's not. So if somebody's on the side of the road with their hazard lights on and they're trying to change a tire, if you pulled over and helped them change the tire, and if they got offended about the intrusion into their privacy, that would seem out of place. So there are many cases like that. If somebody's starving to death and you help them with food, is that offensive intrusion into their privacy? Probably not. If somebody's about to get hit by a car and you push them out of the way, is that an offensive intrusion into their privacy? Probably not, right? So this premise is usually not true. So let's look at the fourth. Making other people the object of one's charity robs them of their dignity and self-respect. While this might sometimes be true, again, not always true. Somebody might recognize that where they are currently they need help, but they might be able to retain their dignity and self-respect even though they currently need help. So let's look at the last premise. Recipients of charity cease to be self-reliant and become passively dependent on others. Again, this premise is sometimes true, but very often not true, and it's a good thing it's not true, because if it were true, none of us would be self-reliant. Let's take as the definition of charity unearned help. So help that is given not because of something somebody's done, but because of a hardship that somebody faces, right? So somebody gives help, gives aid to somebody who hasn't necessarily earned that, whatever we mean by earn. If recipients of charity always ceased to be self-reliant and became passively dependent on others, none of us would be self-reliant because we've all been in a circumstance where we needed help from somebody else and we couldn't do anything at the time to repay the favor, and we hadn't done anything to earn it. And the time I'm talking about is childhood. So we were all children. We needed other people's help. We hadn't done anything to earn it. And yet, hopefully, some of us after that became self-reliant and were not passively dependent on others. Now, somebody might say, I'm stretching the definition of charity here to include a parental relationship. But what I would want to say in response is, even if we use a narrower definition of charity, like monetary assistance to somebody we're not related to, who hasn't necessarily earned that assistance, it still would very often not be the case that people who would receive that aid would cease to be self-reliant and become passively dependent on others. Again, it could be the case that somebody just needs help through a difficult stretch in their life, and then can be more self-reliant and less dependent after that difficult stretch. So again, we see a premise that, at least in many circumstances, is not true. So then what do we say about this whole argument? Well, we say premise 2, 3, 4, and 5 are very often false, so this argument fails what we might call the true premises test. Now, if they were true, they would probably get to the conclusion that we should pursue each of our own self-interest exclusively, but unfortunately, so many of them are not true. And now there's an even bigger problem with this argument, and that's even if it goes all the way through, it doesn't necessarily give us egoism. It seems like it gives us something else. Because note, the goal here seems to be doing what's best for everybody. So more desires will be fulfilled if everybody looks after themselves. We don't want to offend others by looking out for them. When we look out for them, that makes them worse off for a number of reasons. So the concern here seems to be with everybody's well-being. and how we might get the most well-being in the world. But now when we start talking like that, we're talking about a different ethical theory. It seems like this argument actually collapses ethical egoism into utilitarianism. So why should we look out for ourselves according to this? Because everybody will be better off if we look out for ourselves. But now we're not talking about egoism. We're actually talking about utilitarianism, just with a idiosyncratic view of how we should best maximize well-being. Everybody looking out for themselves will somehow magically lead to the most well-being in all cases. And that certainly doesn't seem to be the case, but the strategy that this argument takes seems to have a fundamental flaw. It says we ought to do whatever will promote everyone's best interest. The best way to promote everyone's interest is for each of us to pursue our own interests exclusively. Therefore, each of us should pursue our own interest exclusively, and that's just a weird utilitarianism. So ethical egoism wouldn't be a distinctive ethical theory. It would just be a subfield of utilitarianism with a weird and probably false claim about how we should best promote everyone's best interests. All right, so that argument is not too promising for ethical egoism, so let's take up another one. Ayn Rand, who wrote books like The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, entertaining page-turners. They read like comic books, just with the villains and heroes sort of flipped. She has an argument in support of ethical egoism that goes like this. Each person has only one life to live. If we value ourselves as individuals, then we must agree that this life is of supreme importance. After all, it's all one has and all one is. The ethics of altruism regards the life of the individual as something that may be sacrificed for the good of others. So since altruism is other-regarding, we should sacrifice our own well-being for others. Therefore, the ethics of altruism does not take seriously the value of the individual, and it's all one has and all one is, according to premise 1. Ethical egoism, which allows each person to view his or her own life as being of ultimate value, does take the individual seriously. In fact, it's the only philosophy that does that. Therefore, ethical egoism is the philosophy that we should accept. Now again, this argument, upon reading it once over, seems like it's a good argument. We do only have one life to live. Why not make the most of it? Why not think that we should act exclusively in our own self-interest, because we won't get a do-over, right? But again, there are significant flaws with this argument. One problem is it seems to set up a false dichotomy between egoistic moral philosophies or the moral philosophy of ethical egoism and every other one which Rand deems as altruistic. But first we should note that that's not a legitimate, not a perfectly clear distinction. All of the philosophies that we've covered so far give some weight to to an individual's experience. Think about utilitarianism. A utilitarian doesn't say you should disregard the effects of your action on yourself. They think you deserve moral consideration. How much? Exactly as much as everybody else. So you deserve some, not a tremendous amount of moral consideration, just as much as every other human being alive. So it's not perfectly altruistic. It doesn't say you have no worth. It just says you have worth that's equal to everybody else's worth. This sets up a false dichotomy between ethical egoism and all other philosophies which Rand brands as altruistic, but that doesn't necessarily play out. All right, so let's look at another defense of ethical egoism here and see if that fares better than Rand's argument and the argument that altruism is self-defeating. So, this is the claim that ethical egoism is compatible with common sense. And in many cases it would be. So the duties upon which common sense morality insists are ultimately could be derived from self-interest. So take, for example, the duty not to harm others. Why might we, purely from self-interested motives, want to avoid harming other people? Well, we might want to avoid it because we don't want to be harmed in return, or we don't want to suffer the consequences of harming others, which might be jail or worse, right? The duty not to lie. Why might we want, from purely self-interested reasons, not to lie? We might want not to lie so people can trust us, so we can gain benefits of cooperating with those people, right? And we want them not to lie to us. The duty to keep our promises. We might generally keep our promises because we want people to trust us, and we want people to keep their promises to us. So we can conclude that the duties or the obligations which would be derived from ethical egoism would generally be consistent with common sense morality. But while ethical egoism might be mostly in line with common sense, exceptions will certainly arise. Ethical egoism says self-interest is the only reason to help others, but that just seems like it's not true. We might want to help others out of a genuine concern for them, and to say that that's morally wrong just seems wrong. So this leads us to our next problem, our argument against ethical egoism, that sometimes it would endorse wickedness. So there will be instances where an individual could benefit from doing despicable actions which harm other people. Ethical egoism would recommend performing these actions, that the person pursue their self-interests. Therefore, this argument says we should not subscribe to ethical egoism. There's a classic movie that illustrates the problem with ethical egoism here, or at least a very worrisome feature of ethical egoism, and that's The Third Man by Orson Welles. In the movie, Orson Welles plays a villain that the protagonist it's the protagonist's old friend. The protagonist goes to Vienna to find to investigate the circumstances surrounding the disappearance of his old friend Harry Lime. And Orson Welles is Harry Lime. Eventually he finds him and finds that what Lime has been doing since they last saw each other is taking children's drugs, or taking pharmaceuticals that were ultimately meant for children and watering them down so he could make more profit off selling them back. And the character explains, Lime explains, look, these are just statistics about how many people survive, how many people die, how many children live, how many children die. But what does it mean to me? Here, I'm going to benefit from this, so it's not wrong. Right? So ethical egoism would endorse that sort of behavior. So the argument here says if ethical egoism is endorsing that sort of wickedness, then it's not a theory that we should subscribe to. Another interesting objection to ethical egoism is that it's unacceptably arbitrary. And this objection goes, we should treat people in the same way, so equally, unless there is a good reason not to. There's no good reason to treat my interests as more important than everyone else's. Therefore, we should treat the interests of others as equally important as our own. Therefore, each person should not pursue his or her own self-interest exclusively. The chapter makes a nice comparison here between ethical egoism and other faulty I hesitate to call them philosophies, but moral stances. So racism and sexism. So racism and sexism say that there is a small group of people who deserve more moral consideration than everybody else. For the racist, it's members usually of their own race. For sexist, it's members usually of their own sex. And the reason why they restrict moral consideration to those beings is morally irrelevant. So things like the color of their skin or what particular sex organs they were born with. Those are morally irrelevant reasons for treating one person's interests as more important than other people's interests. So those moral philosophies are broken. And then the book says, well, ethical egoism operates in the same way. It restricts the group of beings that deserve moral consideration to a very small group, a group whose only member is one. That I personally, or you personally, are the only thing that deserves moral consideration, and nothing else does. That the right thing to do is the thing which maximizes your self-interest. It doesn't matter what else is happening. And that seems like a morally irrelevant feature, the fact that I'm me or that you are you. Why should my interests count any more than your interests? All right. So, what can we conclude? We can conclude from this whole lecture that psychological egoism and ethical egoism, while they both seem to initially be attractive theories, in part because oftentimes people do act in their own self-interest, and oftentimes it's right to pursue your own self-interest. There are many exceptions to both of those rules that make them so first make psychological egoism a theory which it doesn't seem we should subscribe to, and ethical egoism a theory which we should not subscribe to. They're both strongly stated that we do pursue our self-interest exclusively, that we should pursue our self-interest exclusively. So if we can find even one counterexample to them, then the theories will be falsified, and it seems that we've presented counterexamples to both of them. So although they initially seem very plausible, the book provides some nice considerations to see why they're problematic. So now let's move on to the quiz questions. So quiz question number 1. What would the truth of both psychological and ethical egoism imply? A, no one could get what they truly want. B, humans could not perform morally wrong actions. Or C, morality would be entirely subjective. So if both psychological and ethical egoism are true, what would that imply? Quiz question number 2. The Wesley Autry case. Recall he was the one who jumped on the subway tracks to pin down the man who was having a seizure to save his life. That's posed as an objection to A, the claim that we always do what we most want to do, B, the support that the claim we always do what we most want to do would provide for psychological egoism, C, the claim that we are always motivated by the expectation of the good feeling our actions will give us, or D, the support that the claim we are always motivated by the expectation of the good feeling our actions will give us would provide psychological egoism. Finally, quiz question 3. Which of the following are good objections to the argument that altruism is self-defeating? A, the premises are not true. B, even if the premise of the sub-argument was true, it wouldn't support the conclusion of the sub-argument. C, it collapses egoism into utilitarianism. Or D, all of the above are good objections to the argument that altruism is self-defeating. All right, so that's our lecture on egoism. I look forward to hearing what you have to say about this week's discussion question. All right, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.